Hello and welcome to History Week 24 as we round third base and head for home in this academic year. We are going to stay in the 13th century this week with the three lessons that are part of this week's input. And we're going to start back in Asia. You'll recall, 700 years ago, our old friend Attila the Hun led his Mongol horde across Asia and into a good chunk of Europe, and actually, in its own way, helped hasten the end of the Roman Empire. Well, the Mongolians got into a conquering mood a few centuries later. You've heard of Attila the Hun, probably. Now, I made an assumption y'all had heard of Eric the Red beforehand and got that thrown back in my face. So I'm assuming you had heard of Attila the Hun before all this, and you might have heard of Genghis Khan, just in terms of a great conqueror. And Genghis Khan certainly falls into that category. We'll show some maps a little later, but you will be astounded at the square footage of land that was conquered by his golden horde of Mongols. It essentially is geographically, the largest conquered kingdom in history. Now, Genghis Khan became chief of his tribe in Mongolia, which is north of China, between China and Russia. And the Mongols were, they were Asian like the Chinese, but mostly nomadic, hill people and whatnot, very loosely organized. But Genghis Khan got them organized. He had a very keen eye for organization. The Mongolians at that time were largely nomadic. They traveled and lived in yurts, which were felt tents that could be picked up and moved everywhere. They basically followed their herds around. Wherever the herds grazed, they would move their yurts, and of course, the herd was food. It was currency as well, and they occupied a good part of what we call the Gobi Desert. The Genghis, when he became head of his tribe, again, strong organizational skills, evidently quite a persuader too, very charismatic. He pulled these disparate groups of wandering people together to form an army, and they set about conquering, first of all, China, which is no small task. China then and now was geographically a huge country, just as big as the United States. And I'm not going to get, again, I've got a strong background in military history, so I'm not going to get into great detail about the military aspect of this conquest, but a lot of the military tactics that Genghis Khan and his horde used were really advanced for that point of history. They mastered siege attacks. You remember the Great Wall of China, you've heard it. The Mongols were able to successfully out-siege China. They mastered the use of surprise attacks. Remember, we talked about Sun Tzu, the great Chinese war philosopher. Well, Genghis Khan clearly read him. He was a master of surprise. They filled moats with sandbags to cross them. They could protect themselves from missiles of giant shields. If you watch Game of Thrones or have any connection to it, they depicted a people called the Dothraki, which were very much based on what we know about the Mongols. One of the basic talents they had, but which was a huge advantage, they could fire bow and arrow from horseback. I can't describe how difficult that is. I tried it in college one time. It is impossible, but they can accurately fire a bow while galloping, not just trotting, but galloping on horseback. That made each and every soldier deadly. And the proof is in the pudding. Genghis Khan was not a moralist. He was not a nice guy. As far as he was concerned, all methods of war were fair as long as he was the winner. He had no problem ordering his men to slaughter entire villages or even cities if they did not basically agreed to his rule after he conquered their military. He was brutal, he was a butcher, but he was also brilliant. We see this combo in history a lot. It's ultimately a bad thing, but Again, there's no doubting the organizational brilliance of Genghis Khan. He established the first Mongol code of laws of any kind. Even Attila had no use for that. Again, he started his conquest in China. Remember the Song dynasty that we talked about, the great arts flourishing? Genghis Khan's Mongol horde pretty much pushed them to the sea. And within a decade, he had pretty well conquered all of China and got even moved north to the Russian areas. Basically, considering the amount of land that he gained, the Mongols conquered about 2/3 of the Eurasian continent. Basically, everywhere they could get without a boat, they had about 2/3 of it under their control, which is just an astounding achievement. He willed his empire to his 4 sons. When he died in 1227, his sons got it, and as we have seen so often through history, the sons were not nearly as successful as the father was in terms of maintaining the empire. But an odd thing happened here. Not one of his sons, but one of his grandsons, Kublai Khan, took over in 1260. By the year 1264, he made Peking, modern-day Peking, the capital of the Mongol Empire, and it came to be known as Xanadu. And if you hear the very famous poem, "In Xanadu did Kublai Khan," yeah, it's based upon this. By the year 1279, he had pretty much reconquered. Again, they had lost some territory under Genghis's less effective sons. But by the year 1279, they had everything back and then some. The Mongols, of course, were the first outsiders to ever conquer mainland China. They started what became known as the Yuan dynasty, not Juan, but Yuan, and they were in place in China for pretty much about 100 years. He spread his rule south to modern-day Burma, Myanmar, and Cambodia, and even most of India. The Hindu dynasty fell under the Mongol horde. They tried to conquer Japan, but a storm, a kamikaze, a typhoon, hit their navy and sunk most of the ships. So Japan, by the grace of the weather gods, was spared from the Golden Horde's wrath. But again, he had land stretching from the Yellow Sea in China to the borders of Europe in the west, a good chunk of Islamic territory. Think about all the different cultures that we've been talking about that geographically fell under his rule. Now, the difference between Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan was that Kublai actually had an appreciation for art and a very strong appreciation for different cultures. Again, these different cultures that they conquered, he was very cool with them maintaining their cultural identity. Arts and science flourished quite a bit under Kublai Khan. He invited outsiders into his court. We'll hear about one of them in a few minutes here. So he had a very open empire. The Mongol horde under Kublai Khan, not Genghis, but Kublai Khan, probably did more to bridge the gap between the East and West, Europe and Asia, than any other entity, certainly before them. Through this, the West learned about all these wonderful Chinese innovations we had been telling you about, and of course, the East, China, benefited as well. But the problem came, and it manifested itself eventually, that the cultures under the Khans were just so different that there was not a lot of unity or bonding among them. You recall when we studied the Roman Empire and the large geographic area they controlled, there were Franks, Goths, Spaniards, Middle Eastern, all, but they shared some commonality as Roman citizens. Again, being a Roman citizen was a big thing, whether or not you were by blood a Jew or a Turk or whatever. They never established that kind of identity under the Mongol Empire, and so because of this separation or this lack of unity, that really invited the eventual downfall of the empire. Eventually, the Chinese completely took back their homeland, And again, much like with Attila, there's really not a lot of what we would say that's a Mongol Empire thing. The Taj Mahal is one example in India. The man who built the famous Taj Mahal was one of the was a notable Mongol leader of the time. But that even today, when you think of Taj Mahal, you don't think of the Mongol Empire, you think of India because it's very representative of Indian culture and history. So much like with Attila, the Mongol Empire, in terms of the artifacts that it left behind, not an awful lot, except for the name Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. Those names still have meaning, but if you go around Europe, and unless you're in actually what's now the country of Mongolia, you're not going to find much evidence. Let's talk about one of these guys who accepted Kublai Khan's invitation to come to China, see what we got here. This is awesome. Or they didn't call it China, of course. It was Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde, Xanadu. Marco Polo. His father and uncle were very noted traders in Venice. That's a city with all the canals and the gondolas in Italy. In 1271, they had heard all the rumors of these people who had been to the East and had seen these wondrous things from the Oriental countries, as they began calling them, and they got curious and they wanted to open trade. Again, they were traders. They were businessmen. They operated pretty much in the entire Mediterranean region, which was a very fertile market. But they wanted to expand, and so they undertook it's a great journey, no matter how you look at it. It took the Polos years to get to China, one of the longest journeys ever recorded in the Middle Ages, and it took them, I think, 7 years is sort of the agreed upon time to get from there to there. So it was, now they stopped and traded along the way. It wasn't like they were trying to get there in record time, but they did have their sights set on the head of the Mongol Empire. And Marco must have impressed Kublai Khan quite a bit, because he eventually made Marco one of his provincial governors within that area around Peking, Xanadu. He sent Marco on errands across the empire, and of course Marco is, absorbing all this in, and he and his uncle and father stayed in China for 17 years, so they really became part of the culture out there. Finally, they headed back home. Rather than caravanning across Asia, they actually took a spice route, is what they called it, through modern-day Indonesia, south of Myanmar and India, hugging along to the coast. They called it the spice route because they pretty much established that route for getting spices. Along the way, they stopped at all these exotic Pacific islands and learned about taro and all these other spices that they brought back. So, again, by the time they got back to Italy, it'd been 24 years, longer than any of you have been alive. The problem was, when they got back, nobody believed them. They started talking about all this silk everywhere and things made of pure jade and da-da-da-da-da. And at first, no one believed him because the tales were so fantastic. But again, eventually they showed him the goods, the stuff that they had brought back. And, just things we take for granted. Paper money. Again, lots of silk. Coal briquettes for heating, things like that. These innovations, fireworks, which as you could imagine, probably made a huge splash in Europe. The odd thing about Marco Polo is a lot of this information would have probably been lost to history if he hadn't been thrown in jail. He was jailed during an uprising, and the man with whom he was jailed was a Frenchman named Rustichello. And, of course, they had a lot of time to kill, so he told Rustichello all of his stories about going to China, all the things he saw. And when they were released from jail, Rustichello wrote and published The Travels of Marco Polo. The collection became very popular. It was translated into other languages. We don't know much about Marco Polo after this, but this Tales of Marco Polo was first received kind of like Robin Hood or King Arthur. It was legend, but it was real. It was actual, and historians eventually connected the dots. And by that time, Polo's story had become so popular in Europe and the Mediterranean that people started insisting on going to China and trading. Let's see what we can do here. The Silk Road was established. It's still called that today. It's basically the trade route between Europe and Asia. And you can imagine how, with these two cultures now purposefully intermingling and coming together, a whole lot of walls are coming down here. Last part of our lesson, we're going to go back to the British Isles and to talk about two very different groups of people who occupy the same island, and two peoples who are now countrymen, have been for a while, but there's always been friction between the northern part of the British Isle and the southern part, England and Scotland. And it really came to a head in the late 13th century. Edward Longshanks was the king of England, and he declared himself the ruler and overlord of Scotland, basically the northern third of the island. And of course, you can imagine how that went over in Scotland with the landowners there. It led to years and battles between Scots and the English. In 1296, 4 years after this declaration, the Battle of Dunbar, Edward I appointed 3 Englishmen to rule over Scotland in place of the Scottish king. So the Scottish king quickly became irrelevant because, again, England had the much larger and better army. A commodore, William Wallace, rather than complaining about the injustice that was being exacted on his people, raised an army of commodores to fight for Scotland. It started the Scottish War for Independence, which lasted really for 32 years. Edward I, when he first heard about William Wallace, he envisioned this commodore peasant army with pitchforks and whatnot. They were not. William Wallace had been classically trained by his uncle and knew Latin, and he knew warfare tactics, and he taught warfare tactics to these peasants. They procured swords and other instruments, so instead of just being a ragtag army with pitchforks and torches, they could do some damage. And they showed them at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Again, I'm not going to geek out on military history here. I will say that in warfare to this point, there was a certain code of chivalry that both sides abided by. If two armies were on opposite sides of a body of water and one army was crossing the bridge to get over there, the army waiting for them would wait for them. They would wait for them to get across the bridge, form up, and now we fight. Well, the Scots were outnumbered. They knew what the score was. The Brits had heavy horse. They had cavalry in that respect. They had many more archers and whatnot. Again, I'm trying not to geek out on you here. The Brits were going to win this battle in all likelihood. Wallace, under his command, they let about a third of the British army, maybe close to half, get across the bridge. Then they attacked while they were still coming across the bridge. They could handle that small portion of the British army, not the whole thing. So while they're bottled up on the bridge, they attack that much smaller British army. And by the time they get off the bridge, they're still standing, and that British army that's attacking them is still only about a half of its size. They routed them. It was seen as a non-chivalrous affront. William Wallace didn't care. He wanted to win, and win he did. Now, a few years later at the Battle of Falkirk, the English routed the Scottish army, but Wallace managed to escape. And he escaped to the mountains, the Highlands of Scotland. And to this day, William Wallace, his name is royalty in Scottish circles. He was eventually captured and tortured and killed in public, but the momentum established by his peasant army gave rise to a much bigger army at least, by Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce was one of the principal landowners of Scotland who had supported Wallace and his Commodore army earlier. Well, now that the Brits had their nose bloodied and then some, and really after a couple of decades of war, they were hurting a little bit. Robert the Bruce put together a very good army, very well trained army. Not that Wallace's wasn't, but Bruce's, he picked it up, and he had the legal claim to the throne of Scotland. And in 1306, they crowned him officially King of the Scots, knowing that it would raise the British ire. At this point, Edward Longshanks was gone, and his son Edward II was the King of England, and he led an army. Edward II led an army of lots of Irish regulars trying to once and for all defeat the Scots. Edward II was not the soldier or leader that his father was. And if you've ever watched Braveheart, I'm trying so hard not to reference it here, but Braveheart, Edward II was masterfully depicted as a very frail and quite frankly weak person. Pope John the 22nd didn't recognize Bruce as the true king of England. He supported Edward and actually excommunicated Bruce, which was odd because England was very lukewarm Catholic. Scottish was clearly Catholic supporters. But Robert the Bruce continued on fighting to maintain himself as King of Scotland, which would have been a meaningless declaration if the British had destroyed them militarily. As a result, several letters were written to the Pope by Robert the Bruce pleading that he recognized Bruce as King of Scotland and recognized, by proxy, Scotland's independence. He wrote the Declaration of Arbroath, named for the abbey where it was written. It was written in 1320. It's famous because it helped spell out the very definition of a free nation, an independent nation. Listen to these words. As long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like, another Declaration of Independence that was written 400 plus years later? Sounds almost identical in some respects. Thomas Jefferson clearly had read the Declaration of Arbroath. Robert the Bruce outlived another king. Edward III took the throne of England, and he was finally willing to end this 32 years of fighting and recognize Bruce as the official sole king of Scotland and Scotland as its own sovereign nation. The Treaty of Edinburgh was signed in 1328, renouncing all English claims to Scotland. Unfortunately for the Scots, the story didn't end there. As you study history, the battles continued, the wars, cultural wars continued. Very interesting sociological study. Two sets of people on the same island being so radically different. You remember the Scots, again, the northern part, lots of Danish blood in there, some of the old Picts, P-I-C-T-S, the pagans and whatnot. Southern, the Saxons, the Angles, the Celts, just different development, really. Kind of like a Hispaniola in North America, the island where Haiti is on the west and Dominican Republic is on the right. One of them speaks Portuguese, the other speaks Spanish. It's a very fascinating thing, and of course, again, if you're an Anglophile, that is someone who studies the history of Great Britain, then the clashes between England and Scotland, or England and Ireland for that matter, are fascinating. Anyway, I did a good job not geeking out and not mentioning the movie Braveheart too much. Anyway, I'll see you Monday.